Game of Thrones was an absolute phenomenon, and still holds the record for being the most watched and theorized about show in the history of television. And although Season 8 was a bit of a disaster as far as the story goes, there's no doubt that the showrunners spared no expense when it came to the virtual effects budget, which brought us some unforgettable moments. But what would Game of Thrones have looked like behind the scenes before the VFX department even got their hands on it? Well, whether you still consider yourself to be a fan of the franchise or just want to know more about how the show shocked us with incredible effects, stay right where you are, as we're about to take a look at what Westeros looked like without CGI. So strap yourselves in and get ready for a bumpy ride, as things are about to get interesting. But before we get into it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe with the notifications turned on, so you don't miss out on any of the new videos we post. Number 1. The Wall. For those of you who need a bit of a reminder, the Wall is described as a colossal fortification that stretches for around 555 kilometers along the northern border of the Kingdom of the North. According to the myth, this giant structure was built with the use of magic to separate Westeros from the realm of constant winter, where the wildlings and feared White Walkers dwell. The Wall takes on a centralized focus in the lore of Game of Thrones, as it was not only built by Brandon the Builder after the War of the Dawn, but also sets the scene for Jon Snow to make a name for himself, and developed from a bastard to one of the greatest leaders the Night's Watch have ever seen. There was a time when Jon was captured by the enemy wildlings beyond the war though, and after falling in love with the young Ygritte, convinced them to climb the wall with him so he could warn his home kingdom and those beyond of the threat of the coming winter. It was a tense episode where Jon, Ygritte, Tormund, and friends climbed the colossal structure with the help of some climbing gear. And although the vast majority of the group died by either falling or being crushed by clumps of ice, this action led to preparations, which essentially defeated the Night King in the end. With the use of virtual effects, we were able to marvel at the incredible structure that was the Wall, not only from the perspective of the climbers, but from a bird's eye view of sorts, which allowed us to grasp just how big of a structure it was. Things were, however, a bit different before the VFX department were able to get their hands on the footage. The bird's eye view perspective, for example, was 100% CGI. In other words, the view we marveled at was nothing more than a computerized rendering of what the Wall and Castle Black would have looked like. Things got a bit more intense when it came to the actual climbing of the Wall, with a small-scale recreation of the ice wall being made on set for acting purposes. The actors would then have themselves secured to the wall with the use of green harnesses that could be removed in post-production. The floor of the set was also covered in green material to allow for a green screen effect, making it easier to remove and replace. The VFX department then used their rendering skills to make the wall appear more realistic and the floor to be covered in mist. Number 2. The Whites. Before we even met the Night King and his fellow White Walkers, we were introduced to a group of enemies called the Whites. Essentially, these enemies were nothing more than ice zombies, if you will, which we later learned were the undead remnants of the victims of the White Walkers, who had been risen from their graves. Not too threatening in a one-on-one situation, but introduce an entire group of Whites and you have yourself a huge problem. Once more, we only ever saw the Whites from two perspectives. The first perspective was from a bird's eye view, showing just how many Whites were surrounding our heroes and causing tension to rise as a result. A good example of this is where we see the Night King perched on a cliff face, while Jon Snow and his friends are surrounded by Whites and frigid cold water covered by a thin layer of ice. It is a standoff of note that will forever be one of the greatest moments from the franchise. That being said, more than half of the scene was complete CGI. You see, whenever the Whites are shown in such a vast number, the virtual effects department was actually using duplicate software to get this effect. In other words, a certain number of extras would be scattered across the area with the VFX department, then using their body shapes and positions to make a number of virtual doubles. Spread these doubles across the opening space and you have yourself a realistic looking army of Whites. The second perspective required a lot more work, as it saw some of our heroes coming in close contact with the Whites. The human brain can be tricked quite easily when the camera is far away, but you can't exactly fool it by having a number of doubles being in full view of the audience. This is why extras were decked out in some of the best practical makeup to make them appear to be dead. They were then taught how to walk and act a specific way, keeping a certain amount of rigor mortis in mind while doing so. The Whites who had actual pieces of their bodies missing, such as a jaw or arm, would then require further work from the CGI team, who would then remove the body parts as the script deemed necessary. Last but not least, the cold and wintry conditions that followed these creatures had to be created with the use of virtual effects as well, which took the form of a complex VFX weather rendering model. This also hid some of the facial features of the whites, hiding some of the shoddier forms of CG and practical makeup in post. Number 3. The Night King. And since we really can't talk about whites without at least mentioning the Night King and the rest of his icy cronies, we thought we'd also let you know how the virtual effects department was able to bring these frightful creatures to life. Surprisingly enough, the showrunners decided to make the Night King and White Walkers as practical as possible to maintain a certain amount of realism on set. This means that the wardrobe department had to kit these characters out in the killer threads that we saw them wear during the runtime of the show, while the props department had the job of giving them realistic-looking spears and swords. Masks were then used to give each White Walker a different face, with the makeup department adding realism by touching these masks up a bit. It's not like the VFX department had nothing to do when these enemies were on the screen, as there were quite a few touch-ups that had to be made to sell the idea that both the Night King and White Walkers were a deadly bunch. First of all, weather rendering needed to be worked on to give the impression that this group brought winter with them, making them appear to be a lot more sinister than they were on set. Visual effects were also used to place them in the realm beyond the Northern Kingdom, which on set consisted of nothing more than a green screen. The group would also usually be leading a large group of whites, the majority of which had to be generated with the use of duplicate software, as we explained before. And lastly, the VFX department was also given the job of manipulating the eyes of the White Walkers, making them an almost luminescent crystal blue. Number 4. The Dire Wolves. It's unfortunate that the majority of the dire wolves didn't last very long, but since the showrunners knew that audiences had an adverse reaction to the killing of cute pups, there was no better way to develop feelings of anger and hatred towards the enemy. Next to no CGI was necessary when we first met Ghost and the rest of the dire wolves back in Season 1, as they look similar to animals that we have all seen here in the real world. That being said, things changed a bit when the good boys and girls grew up into massive creatures with sharpened teeth and colossal paws. The audience also started to realize at this point that the dire wolves were appearing less and less in the franchise, which is actually due to the fact that they were being 100% rendered by the visual effects department, who were essentially designing them from scratch. To give a good example of this, we have to take a trip back in time to the Battle of Winterfell, where Ghost featured in the fight against the Whites and Walkers. His CGI form had immaculate fur effects, visually stunning red eyes, and a surprisingly expressive face. On set, however, things were a lot different, with the prop department actually creating a stuffed version of the creature to act as a placeholder for where he was during the scene. This actually caused quite a buzz on social media when the audience discovered what Ghost looked like prior to being rendered. With next to everyone speaking out about just how nightmarish and bland he looked, it was thus up to the VFX department to take this placeholder in each and every scene and ensure they did everything they could to make him look and move as realistically as possible. And we have to say, they did a pretty fine job. If only CGI could have been used to help Jon say goodbye to his favorite good boy. Number 5. The Dragons. Like any fantasy series, Game of Thrones became incredibly popular once dragons were introduced into the franchise. Just thinking about it takes us back to that fateful day when Daenerys was gifted the 3 dragons and told to take care of them as if they were her birthright. When these dragons were born, however, the virtual effects department had to work pretty hard to render them like the dire wolves before. What made this worse is that dragons are mythical creatures, with there being no other similar creatures to compare them to in the real world. This was then even made harder when the VFX department had to create fully grown dragons that characters like Jon and Daenerys could actually ride on. This took the form of the rider getting on a mechanical bull-like rig, which moved in different directions to give the impression that the rider was actually flying. Once shot, the CGI wizards on the payroll would step in and build the dragon around this rig, creating the impression that it was actually being ridden. So, what do you think of Game of Thrones without its precious CGI? Feel free to let us know in the comment section down below.